Some debts can't be settled with coin. Abel Harkin knew that the morning he found the Apache woman kneeling in the dust beside his youngest boy, her hands moving with a calm certainty that tightened something deep in his chest. Jace had been screaming for an hour straight. Now he lay silent, eyes wide, watching the woman like she held the answers to questions Abel didn't even know how to ask. 3 families had turned him down that week. Wouldn't say why, but their faces told him plenty. Folks had already made up their minds about a man who couldn't keep his own house in order. But this woman hadn't asked questions, hadn't judged. She just knelt and got to work. That scared him more than he cared to admit. The ranch stretched bare under the noonday sun, fence lines sagging, cattle drifting lazy through brittle grass. Abel stood on the porch, his hat shading eyes worn hollow from months without sleep, watching her hands move, quick and sure. Jace sat still as stone now, his small arm cradled gently while she wrapped it in neat cloth strips pulled from her worn leather satchel. The fall from the hayloft had been Abel's fault. He'd been on the roof fixing leaks, should have been watching the boys, should have been a dozen places at once. But that was the trouble, wasn't it? Caleb Harkin stood a dozen feet away, arms folded, jaw clenched harder than any boy his age ought to manage. He'd found her at the trading post like his father asked, brought her back. But the look in his eyes now said he wished he hadn't. Said she didn't belong here. Said this was still his mother's home, even after 2 years gone. Nita never looked up. Her fingers tied the last knot with the precision of someone who'd done this more times than she could count. When she stood and brushed the dust off her fringed skirt, Abel saw how young she really was. No more than her late 20s. But those eyes of hers held something far older. They'd seen grief, and they recognized it in him. "He'll mend," she said quietly, firmly. "Keep the arms still. No climbing for 3 weeks." Jace gazed up at her like she'd spoken gospel. He hadn't looked at anyone like that since Lila died. Abel felt his throat catch. "What do I owe you?" he asked. She shook her head, already packing her things. "Nothing. I can pay." "I don't need payment." Behind them, Caleb made a sound. Not a word, but enough. Abel knew what it meant. The boy wanted her gone. Wanted things back the way they were. Wanted his mama to come walking through that door like death was something a stubborn heart could argue with. Nita turned toward her horse, buckshot, tied near the trough. She walked like someone who'd left 1,000 times before, like staying had never been an option. Abel's mind raced. The cattle still needed moving. The east fence was falling. There were contracts to honor, feed to buy, and 2 boys who needed more than he had left to give. He was drowning, and the town watched like they'd already mourned him. "Wait," he heard himself say. She stopped, didn't turn around, but her shoulders shifted just slightly. Abel looked at Jace, still cradling his wrapped arm, still staring at her like she might vanish if he blinked. Looked at Caleb, stiff with grief too heavy for 8-year-old bones. Looked out over the ranch falling to ruin no matter how many hours he bled into it. "How long you planning to stay in these parts?" he asked. Now she turned, her dark eyes meeting his like they saw clean through him. It made him feel exposed in a way he hadn't in years. "I don't stay long," she said. "Why not?" A flicker crossed her face. Pain, or maybe memory. "People usually don't want me around longer than they have to." Caleb shifted. Abel didn't. "I might have work," he said slowly, "if you're open to it." Nita's face didn't change, but her hand gripped Buckshot's reins just a little tighter. "What kind of work?" Abel opened his mouth. Closed it. How the hell did you ask a stranger to step into the hollowed-out mess of your life? How did you admit you were failing at the one thing that mattered most? Before he could speak, Caleb did, his voice sharp and cutting like broken glass. We don't need you here. The silence that followed felt like something living and angry. Nita's eyes moved from Abel to the boy, and for a heartbeat, Abel saw it. Understanding, like she knew exactly what it felt like to be unwanted. She nodded once and started to turn away. And Abel felt panic rise, cold and sudden. If she left now, she'd take something with her he didn't have a name for. But his sons needed it. He needed it. Please, he said. The word came rough, raw. Just hear me out. She turned slowly, her hand still resting on Buckshot's neck. The mare shifted under her touch, sensing hesitation. Horses knew when folks were about to do something foolish. Abel stepped off the porch, walked to her, but kept a respectful distance. Up close, she could see the toll on his face. Not just exhaustion. He was hollowed out like a tree struck by lightning and left standing. My wife died giving birth to Jace, he said, voice low. Fever took her 3 days later. I've been raising them alone ever since. Her eyes slid past him toward the boys. Jace still sat where she'd left him. Caleb stood like a sentinel, guarding memories he didn't understand. They need more than I can give, Abel said. I mend fence, they're alone. I move cattle, they're alone. And when I'm... He stopped, swallowed. They're always alone. They shouldn't be. Nita didn't speak, but she didn't walk away either. You want me to watch them, she said. Flat, not a question. I want you to care for them, Abel replied. Teach them. Be here when I can't. He took a breath. I can pay, not much, but fair. You'd have a room, food, whatever you need. The offer hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Nita felt that old pull, the urge to mount up and disappear beyond the edge of whatever place she'd wandered into. That's what she did. She helped, then left. Before questions. Before anyone looked too close. But Jace was still watching her, and something inside her chest ached in a way she'd almost forgotten. Your boy doesn't want me here, she said, tilting her head toward Caleb. He's 8, Abel replied, jaw tight, and angry at a world that took his mama. But he doesn't get to decide this. He lives here. His feelings matter. You're right, they do. Abel looked back at Caleb, something softening in his weathered face. But so does keeping him fed, safe, making sure he grows up with more than grief and cattle. Nita studied the ranch with a quiet stillness. The house looked tired. Boards sun-bleached and gray, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. The corral fence leaned like old men in the wind, posts barely standing. This was a place held together by sheer stubbornness. She knew that kind of fight. Lived it. I don't stay long, she said again, softer now. To her own ears, it sounded less like a decision and more like a warning. Then stay as long as you can. It wasn't Abel Harkin who said it. It was Jace. He rose carefully, still cradling his bandaged arm, and walked toward her like a boy trying not to step on something already broken. He stopped just in front of her, chin tilted up, eyes wide with something too tender to bear. Are you going to stay? He asked, voice small but clear. She looked at him, then at Abel, then at Caleb Harkin, still stiff near the house, his arms crossed like armor, every part of him screaming defiance. Then she looked at the land. This ranch that would eat Abel alive if someone didn't step in. And then she looked inward, at that familiar, echoing emptiness, whispering, maybe this time it could be different. "I'll stay a few days," she said carefully. "Help with the boys while you work. After that, we'll see." Abel's shoulders sank just slightly, the breath he'd been holding slipping out like a man unclenching a fist. "That's all I'm asking." They both knew it was a lie. He was asking for more. She was offering more. But neither was ready to say what that meant. Caleb turned without a word and disappeared into the house, shutting the door with a quiet firmness. Not a slam. Worse. A decision. "He'll come around," Abel muttered, though he didn't sound sure. Nita stared after the boy, wondering what she'd just signed herself into. Wondering if a few days would cost her more than she could afford. Wondering if, maybe, it was exactly what her heart had been waiting for. 3 days passed like creek water over a flat stone, slipping through before you could hold them. Nita slept in a small room off the kitchen, one that still held the ghost of someone else. The faded curtains, the soft creak in the floor, traces of Lila Harkin. She rose before dawn each morning, stoked the fire, cooked breakfast. Jace devoured every bite. Caleb picked at his food with dramatic disinterest. While Abel worked the land, she taught the boys how to spot healing plants, how to wash and wrap a wound, how to read weather from the sky. She told them old stories her grandmother whispered into firelight. Jace drank it all in like rain on dry earth. Caleb pretended not to care, but she caught him leaning in when he thought she wasn't looking. On the 4th morning, Abel found her behind the house, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. The sun had just crested the hills, casting golden shadows across the yard. "You're good with them," he said, settling on the porch step. His hat rested in his hands, hair flattened underneath. "They're easy to care for," she replied without looking up. "Jace is curious. Caleb's protective. Both are good things." "He still barely talks to you." "He speaks when it counts." She paused her grinding. "Yesterday, he asked if I knew his mother." Abel's hand tensed on his hat. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that I didn't." She resumed grinding, stone against stone, steady and sure. "But I told him I can see her in him, in his loyalty, in his strength." Something in Abel's face softened, the lines of grief easing just enough to reveal the man he'd once been. That was kind. It was honest. They sat in a peace so still it felt like glass. Birds called to the sun. Cattle stirred far off. A hush that asked them not to break it. Then Abel said, gentle as dusk, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "You said people don't usually want you around. Why?" Nita's hands froze over the pestle. She'd known that question would come. They always did. Why was a woman alone? Why didn't she stay? Why did she drift? "I move from place to place," she said slowly. "I help where I can. Most folks are grateful, for a while, but they don't like to keep folks like me too long." "Hey, folks like you?" he echoed, not as challenge but as invitation. She set the pestle down and wiped dust from her fingers. Then she met his gaze head on. "A woman with no family, no children, no future the way people expect." "You don't have children." It wasn't pity in his voice, just quiet fact. "I can't," she said, the words cutting more than she meant them to. "There was an accident when I was younger. Internal injuries. The healer said I was lucky to survive." "Lucky?" she laughed, bitter, as if surviving with nothing left to build on is some kind of prize. Abel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't flinch. Didn't fill the silence with sorries. That alone made her respect him more than he'd ever know. That's why you drift, he said, understanding blooming in his voice. Easier to move than be reminded of what's missing. She nodded once. Every town has babies, women with bellies, kids screaming in yards. You see it all and feel like you're looking in through the glass. She turned her head, listening to the faint laughter of Jace through the window. But you stayed here, he said. I said a few days. It's been 4. She didn't answer. Or maybe she didn't have an answer she was willing to speak yet. That Jace's laughter carved out space in her chest, where there'd only been quiet. That Caleb's guarded defiance gave her purpose. That Abel looked at her like a person, not a burden. Then came hoofbeats. 3 riders on the road, casual in the way men are when they think the land belongs to them. Nita didn't need introductions. She'd seen the type before. Too many times. Abel stood, hat on, shoulders squared. Wait inside, he said low. Who are they? Neighbors. The word was sharp, like threat. They heard I had help. They've got opinions. She didn't move. What kind of opinions? The riders got closer, and she could make out their faces. Hard men with harder eyes, the kind who measured worth by how well you fit their narrow world. Abel looked at her. There was an apology in his eyes. The kind that won't matter, he said, if you don't let them. But as the 3 men reined in near the porch, their eyes raking over her like she was dirt under a boot heel, Nita knew better. Opinions like that always mattered, even when you wished they didn't. The oldest of the 3 dismounted, boots hitting dirt with the certainty of a man used to telling others how to live. Gray in his beard, judgment in his eyes. Hearken, he said, not friendly. Then his gaze moved to Nita. Heard you brought in outside help. I needed help, Abel Harkin said flatly, his voice calm but firm. And I got it. The older man's jaw worked like he was chewing rocks. The other 2, Dusty Maris and Boone Taggart, stayed mounted on either side, their silence more threatening than any words. There's families in town, the man growled, who could have sent daughters, women who know how to keep a proper house. I asked, Abel replied, still steady. They all had reasons to say no. Maybe you didn't ask hard enough. He stepped forward, dropped his voice, just enough that anyone nearby could still hear, especially Nita. You've got boys to raise, Abel. What kind of example are you setting, dragging her into your home? That old, bitter tightness crawled into Nita's chest. The assumption that her mere presence tainted something wasn't new. She'd heard variations of it in too many towns, always hoping the next place might be different. It never was. The example I'm setting, Abel said, his voice sharpening like a whetstone on steel, is that I take care of my sons however I damn well need to, and I don't remember asking your opinion about it. The tension pulled taut, brittle as a dry fence wire ready to snap. The 2 mounted men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting near rifle stocks, not drawing, just reminding. Violence was never off the table out here, just waiting for an excuse. Then a voice cut through the silence. Pa. Jace stood in the doorway, small arm wrapped against his chest, eyes wide and unblinking. The word cracked something open in the moment. Roy Cutter looked at the boy, then at Abel. His mouth tightened. You're making a mistake. That's my right. The men didn't argue. They turned their horses toward the road. But just before they vanished, Roy looked back over his shoulder. Mistakes have consequences, Harkin. For you, for them boys. And then they were gone, leaving only hoofprints in the dust and the kind of silence that stings in your ears. Nita moved toward Buckshot by the trough. She'd packed light. Wouldn't take long to be gone. Just like always. Help Get judged, ride on. That was the rhythm. It had never failed. Don't, Abel said behind her, quiet but firm. She kept walking. I should leave before this gets worse. It's already worse, he said, catching up to her. Has been, long before you came along. He matched her step for step now. Not blocking, just walking with her. You leaving won't change what they think. It just means I go back to failing on my own. You're not failing. I'm drowning. He stopped short. And she had to stop too, because he stepped in front of her, not to trap her, but to look her square in the eye. I've been drowning since Lila died. Nita didn't say anything, didn't trust herself to. You know what I see when I look at you? He asked. Still, she said nothing. I see someone who knows what it means to carry too much for too long. His voice dropped low, urgent. My boys, they need more than I can give alone. They need someone who sees them as people, not chores. Someone who cares about who they become, not just whether they eat and sleep. You already do that. You're their father, she said softly. You could be all that. He took a breath, recalibrated. You could be what they need, what we need. Her grip tightened on Buckshot's reins. What are you asking me, Abel? He looked back at the house. Jace was still in the doorway, face full of silent pleading. Caleb Harkin now stood behind him, arms crossed. Not angry this time, just watching, waiting. Two boys left motherless too young. Two boys trying to stay afloat in a world that didn't give second chances. When Abel turned back to her, something in him had shifted. Less desperation, more clarity. You told me you can't have children, he said. The words landed like a blow. Her chest tightened, face betraying the sting before she could stop it. Yes, she whispered. Then you'll raise mine instead. The world held its breath. Even the wind stilled. She stared at him, sure she'd misheard, that maybe grief had twisted his words into something they couldn't possibly mean. What? Stay, he said. Not just as help, as part of this family. He spoke faster now, like if he stopped, the courage might slip away. Raise my sons, teach them, guide them, be their mother, the mother you should have had the chance to be. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take the future you lost and build it here, with us. He gestured toward the house. They need you. I need you. And if I'm not wrong, you need this too. Her throat burned. Tears pressed behind her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. This wasn't how life worked. The world didn't hand you the one thing you mourned as impossible. Didn't turn your deepest wound into your greatest purpose. Those men don't matter, Abel said. What matters is in that house. Two boys who deserve more than what they've had, and a woman who deserves more than running from ghosts. He was right. She felt it down in her bones. But saying yes meant tearing down all the walls she'd built to keep from hoping. I don't know if I can, she said. Abel's gaze softened. Then stay long enough to find out. 2 weeks blurred into 3. 3 into a month. Every morning, Nita told herself she was just helping until Abel found a permanent solution. But the lie grew weaker with each sunrise. Jace followed her everywhere, asking about herbs and weather and why birds sang differently in the morning. His arm healed straight and strong, but every dawn, he still checked if she was there. Caleb stayed cautious. The outright hostility had faded, replaced by silent tests. Watching. Waiting. Would she vanish? Would she fail? Yesterday, he asked her for help with a math problem. Today, he said, almost nothing. Tomorrow? Who knew? He's scared, Abel said one evening as they prepped supper. He was cutting vegetables while she stirred a bubbling pot. He's scared if he starts to care about you, he continued. You'll leave, like his mama did. She didn't choose to go, Nita said, watching the steam curl. He's 8, Abel replied. He doesn't see the difference between can't stay and won't stay. He just knows people he loves disappear. He moved closer, handed her the cut vegetables. She could feel the warmth coming off him, the scent of sweat and saddle leather. She took the bowl. Their hands brushed. Just a second, but long enough to make her heart skip. They'd been careful, keeping space. But the house was small. The days were long. Distance became harder to keep. You're thinking too loud, Abel said gently. I'm thinking you've made this more complicated than it needs to be. How's that? She turned. He was closer than she expected. Close enough to see the golden flecks in his eyes and the fine lines from years squinting into sunlight. You asked me to raise your boys, to be part of this family, but you never said what that really meant. What do you want it to mean? The question settled heavy between them, like dust before a coming storm. Nita knew what she wanted, had known for weeks, maybe longer. But wanting something and holding it in your hands were two different things, and the space in between felt as wide as the frontier. I want, she began, but Caleb Harkin burst through the door, face pale, voice tumbling in panic. Jace fell, down by the creek, he's not getting up. The three of them ran, cutting across the yard, past the barn, and through the sloping pasture toward the creek that marked the eastern edge of the land. Nita reached him first, dropped to her knees in the cold water beside the boy's small body. Jace lay face down, one leg twisted in a way that made her gut knot. Jace, she called, her voice sharp. She turned him gently, checking his breathing. Still there. His pulse. Steady. The boy groaned, his eyelids flickering. Don't move, she said quickly. Let me look first. Abel Harkin knelt on the other side, hands trembling just above his son, afraid to touch. Is he? He's breathing. He's awake. She ran her hands down Jace's arms, then his ribs, moving with calm precision. Her fingers paused just below the knee. His leg's broken. We need to set it and keep him still. Caleb stood back, shaking. I'm sorry. I told him not to climb those rocks. I told him, but he didn't listen, and he just... Caleb, Nita looked up at him. Guilt and fear warred in his eyes. This isn't your fault. Accidents happen. What matters is you got help fast. You did right. Something broke in the boy's expression. The walls he'd built since she arrived finally cracked, his fear pouring through. Is he going to be okay? Yes. She said it firmly. Even if part of her wasn't sure, it was what he needed. But I need both of you to help me. Can you do that? Caleb nodded, wiping at his face with his sleeve. Abel's jaw was tight, but his hands were steady when he lifted his son. Together, the three carried Jace back to the house, moving in sync like folks who had learned to depend on each other without saying it out loud. In crisis, Nita knew what to do. She took charge, clear and calm. The feelings between her and Abel? That was different. That was a kind of wild she hadn't yet mapped. They laid Jace on his bed. Nita sent Caleb for her medicine pouch, Abel for splints. Alone for a moment, Jace opened his eyes wide, looking straight at her. Am I gonna die? He asked, his voice small. No, sweetheart. The word slipped out, natural, soft. Your leg's broken, but I'm gonna fix it. You'll be walking again before you know it. Promise? She brushed a hand over his hair. I promise. Caleb returned with her bag. Abel came with wood. Together they worked, Nita guiding their hands as they set the bone, wrapped it tight. Jace bit down on a strip of leather, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. But he never moved. He trusted her. When it was done, Abel carried his son to a better bed. Nita and Caleb cleaned the rest. The boy worked quietly, but then stopped and looked at her. You're not leaving, are you? It wasn't accusation, wasn't even a plea, just raw hope wrapped in fear. Nita met his eyes and realized, somewhere in the last few weeks, she'd already made the choice. Maybe it was the first night Abel asked her to stay, or maybe it was the way Jace had looked at her, with a kind of faith she hadn't known she needed. No, she said. I'm not leaving. Caleb nodded once, sharp and sure. Then, before she could blink, he hugged her hard and took off down the hall to check on his brother. She stood there in the hallway, the light fading outside. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a cliff. It felt like open land. Jace healed slowly, his splint keeping him restless. Nita stayed close, telling stories, teaching him to weave from dried grass, pointing out bird calls from the window. Caleb sat with them more now, quiet, listening though he pretended not to. 3 weeks after the fall, Abel came back from a cattle drive. 2 days out on the range had left him dust-covered, bone-tired. He slumped against the house wall on the porch. Nita sat down beside him, keeping a careful inch of space. You should rest, she said gently. Should do a lot of things. He didn't open his eyes. Most of them I can't manage. You're doing more than most men could. Most men don't have help like you. He looked at her now, really looked. I don't know how to thank you. For them. For us. You gave me a home, a reason to stay. That's thanks enough. It's not. He turned toward her, voice low. You saved Jace, twice. You gave Caleb back something I'd thought was gone, a way to trust. You made this house feel like a home. The air felt heavier than any storm. Nita's heart beat faster. She wasn't sure if it was fear or hope. Abel, she began, her voice soft. When Lila died, I thought that part of my life went with her. I figured I'd survive, raise the boys and just get through. I didn't think about being happy again. Didn't think I deserved it. You do, she whispered. You deserve that and more. So do you. His voice cracked a little. You deserve to be more than just the help. You deserve to be seen, wanted, chosen. The words hit her chest like a stampede. She couldn't breathe. The boys need me, she said weakly. That's enough. Is it? He stood and held out his hand. She took it. He pulled her gently up. But he didn't let go. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. Because I think you need more than that. And I think so do I. They stood in the porch light, dusk curling around them. His hand warm in hers, the smell of horses and leather and dust between them. This is complicated, she said. Life's complicated. He lifted his other hand slowly, giving her time. She didn't move. His palm rested at her waist, solid, warm, steady, and she didn't pull away. She should have pulled away. She knew better. She'd told herself to keep a safe distance, keep it simple, for the boys' sake. But standing there on the porch with the cool night wrapping around them and Abel's eyes looking at her like she was the only thing left in the world worth holding on to, reason had no place. I shouldn't, she whispered. Those men who came before, they'll twist this, use it against you, against us. They'll say things, Things that'll hurt the boys. Let him talk. His voice was low, steady as stone. His hand didn't pull, just stayed there at her waist, anchoring her like a stake in the wind. I spent 2 years worrying what folks thought, trying to fit into their little boxes. I'm done with that. He looked her square in the eye. My boys are safe, happy, loved. That's what matters. She blinked, her breath catching. And you? What about what you want? His answer came without hesitation. I want you to stay, not because I need a hand raising them, not because you're useful, but because every time I think of what life could look like, Nita, you're in it. All of it. Her hand rose, rested over his chest where his heart pounded hard and fast, just like hers. I'm scared, she said, almost too soft to hear. Of what? That I'll believe this, that I'll let myself want it, and it'll get ripped away. I can't promise nothing bad'll ever happen. He leaned his forehead to hers. The closeness, the quiet, stole the breath right out of her chest. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere. This isn't temporary. You're not temporary. Not to me. Not to them. Inside, tiny footsteps crossed the floorboards. Jace, probably up for water. The spell didn't break. It settled. They stepped back, not letting go entirely. I should check on him, Nita murmured. I know. But Abel's hand lingered one heartbeat longer before letting go. She paused at the doorway. He said her name again, gently. Nita? She turned. We're not done with this talk. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And her pulse beat faster for it. No, she said quietly. We're not. She tucked Jace back into bed, soothed him with gentle words and a soft hand. But her thoughts were still outside. On Abel, on the weight of his hand, on the shape of something new beginning to form between them. The next morning, the air still held a bite, though the sun was rising fast. The trading post sat like a tired old dog at the edge of town. Weathered, wooden, glass dusty. Nita hadn't stepped inside since arriving. Supply runs were Abel's domain. But Jace needed boots. His feet had outgrown the pair faster than expected. Caleb wanted a book another boy had mentioned. So they rode in together. Jace sat bundled in front of her, legs still splinted but stronger by the day. Caleb rode beside them, straight-backed and watchful, like a pint-sized protector. They hadn't even hit Main Street before the stairs began. Talk dried up. Women gripped their children's hands tighter. Men shifted toward their belts, not drawing iron, just reminding her it was there. She'd seen it all before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Don't look at him, Caleb said under his breath. She'd said the same to him once. They tied up the horses. Caleb led the way into the store. The man behind the counter, a graying fellow with narrow eyes, watched them come in. Morning, he said, voice dry as sun-baked dust. Morning, Mr. Granger, Caleb replied, polite as church. We need boots for Jace, one size up. Granger's brow lifted. He'd braced for trouble. Got manners instead. All right, he muttered, disappearing into the back. Just then, a woman stepped in. Middle-aged, stiff-backed, looked like the kind who held sway in a place like this. She spotted Nita, paused. Her expression sharpened. You're the one staying at the Rivers place. Yes, ma'am, Nita replied, calm and respectful. The woman's gaze shifted to the boys. Jace clung to Nita's side. Caleb stood just ahead of them, chest out. They look better, she said finally. Healthier. Happier, too. Nita didn't dare reply. Abel Harkin's a good man, the woman continued. Lost his wife too young. We offered help. He didn't take it. Her eyes locked with Nita's. Seems he finally found what he needed. Not approval, not rejection either. Something firmer. Acknowledgement. Granger returned with boots. Jace slipped them on. Perfect, he declared. Caleb clutched his book like treasure. As they paid, the woman lingered. Tell Abel Margaret Foster says hello, she called as they walked out. And supper's on offer, if y'all are so inclined. Nita turned, touched her hat. Thank you, Mrs. Foster. That's mighty kind. The ride home felt different. Lighter. She was nice, Jace said, hugging his boots. Some folks are, Caleb said. Then, soft. You're staying, right? For real? For real, Nita said, and realized she meant it. Abel was out by the corral, shirt dark with sweat, arms roped from work. He straightened as they rode in, eyes going first to her. It went well, she said as she helped Jace down. Mrs. Foster invited us to supper. Margaret Foster? He echoed, eyebrows raised. She's particular. Apparently we passed. The boys raced over to show him their treasures. Nita led the horses to the barn. She was just unbuckling the saddle when Abel stepped behind her. Close. Warm. You went into town, he said. Had to. With the boys. She turned to face him. His hand touched her elbow. Just a feather-light gesture. Took courage, he murmured. Or foolishness. No. His thumb traced circles on her arm, setting her nerves ablaze. Courage. You showed 'em you belong. Is that what I did? Ain't that what it looks like? From where I'm standing, seems like you're building something here. Her hand settled on his chest again. She felt his heartbeat. Steady. Strong. And if I am, she said slowly, then I need you to know. His hands came up, framing her face like something precious. I love you, Nita, he said. Not 'cause you help with the boys. Continued next part. Not because you make my life easier, she whispered, but because you're kind, Abel. Because you see what's broken and don't look away. You stay. You mend. And when I look at you, I feel like I belong somewhere for the first time. Tears shimmered in Nita's eyes. You don't have to say it back. I don't expect anything. I needed you to know. Abel reached for her hands, voice rough. I do feel the same. Been feeling it for a while now. Just didn't know how to name it. I love you too, she admitted, soft as a secret set free. Been afraid of it, but it's real. You're not just help or safety. You're home. His grin was slow, like dawn peeking over the ridge. Still scared? Terrified, she said, laughing through a breath, but not running. That's my girl. He kissed her then, gentle, reverent, full of all the truths they'd never dared speak. And when she leaned into him, fingers knotted in his shirt, the kiss deepened, became promise. When they pulled away, breathless, foreheads resting together, Nita felt something inside her loosen, the weight of years slipping off her shoulders. The boys, she began, are inside playing, Abel finished, smirking. We got a few more minutes. She laughed, truly laughed. A few more minutes for what? For telling you I want forever, for asking if you do too. She pressed her lips to his. I do. I want it all. From the house came Caleb's voice calling them back. Real life tugging, but it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. They walked hand in hand, her head against his shoulder. Two people who'd been wrecked by life, now standing whole. Two people building something new from the wreckage. Something real. Tomorrow would bring more battles, but tonight? Tonight they were enough. This makeshift, beautiful family was enough. 6 months later, everything and nothing had changed. The ranch still needed mending. Fences still leaned. Cattle still wandered too far. But the house no longer felt like a place folks just passed time in. It felt lived in. It felt loved. Nita stood at the stove, flour on her fingers, shaping dough for the day's bread. Morning sun lit the worn floorboards, windows sparkling clean. Behind her she heard Abel's boots on wood, that familiar rhythm, like home. Jace was first to shuffle in, all sleep and warm limbs. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Mornin', Ma," he murmured. "Mornin', sweetheart." She turned and kissed his forehead. "Go get your brother. Breakfast's near ready." He bounded off. She heard his knock on Caleb's door, heard the groaned reply, and smiled. They fought like real brothers now, over chores, over dinner, over who got to ride buckshot next. But they fought with love. Abel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her like he still couldn't believe she was real. "What?" she asked, teasing. "Just looking at my wife." The word still made her heart catch. They'd stood before Clara Weller and half the town 4 months back. Spoke vows that didn't change much, just made official what they already knew. Those who didn't approve stayed quiet. The rest? They clapped and smiled and brought pie. Caleb stumbled out, hair wild, rubbing his eyes. He didn't speak, just leaned into her side as she served. She marveled at how normal it felt, how the boys had gone from guarded to grounded. They ate together. Caleb talked about school. Jace chattered about a hawk nest he'd found. Abel spoke of fence posts and winter feed. It was simple. It was perfect. After breakfast, Jace lingered by her chair. "Ma," he said. Clear. Proud. Her heart nearly stopped. He'd been trying it out for weeks, but this was the first time he'd said it like it was real. "Yes, baby? Can I bring James over after school?" She glanced at Abel, who gave a nod. "Of course you can." Jace grinned and bolted. Caleb stayed a moment longer, his voice soft. "Ma, when James comes, can we show him the swing we made?" Her throat tightened. She crossed the room and pulled him into her arms. "You can show him anything you want." He hugged her tight, then ran out into the yard. Abel came up behind her, arms circling her waist, chin on her shoulder. "You all right?" "Better than all right." She turned. "Did you hear?" "I heard." His voice was thick with emotion. "They're yours now." "They always were." Her fingers brushed his cheek. "From the moment you asked me to stay. That was it for me." He kissed her soft. "I asked a stranger to raise my boys." "I wasn't a stranger," she said gently. "I was just family neither of us knew yet." Through the window, she watched the boys run and tumble, watched the ranch stretch wide and golden. She'd believed for too long that not having children meant she couldn't be a mother, that her worth ended at her body's limits. But these boys had shown her otherwise. "What are you thinking?" Abel murmured. "That I told you once I couldn't have children." She faced him. "But I was wrong. I do. 2 of them. They're mine." "They've always been yours," he said. "From the minute you stayed." She smiled through tears. "You gave me everything I thought I'd lost. A home, a family, a reason to stay put." He kissed her forehead. "You gave us the same." Outside, Caleb called for help with some wild plan. They stepped out into the sun together. Nita looked at the land, at the life they'd built. These boys who called her Ma. This man who loved her, not despite her scars, but because of them. This family, this future, this home. She'd once told Abel, "I can't have children." He'd answered, "Then you'll raise mine instead." And she had. She did. She would. But now, with his child growing beneath her heart, with laughter filling the yard, with love wrapping around them like a warm wind, she understood something deeper. They were all raising each other, together, as family. By choice, not blood. By love, not fate. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.